In today's lecture for NRC, I would be introducing you to Eastern communication philosophy, particularly the philosophies of Indian Buddhism, Indian Jainism at one level, and Buddhism and Jainism in the context of their South Indian philosophical context or South Indian origin. We are, as everyone says, in the age of so many revolutionary kinds of new media and internet media and social media communications. In my opinion, communication as a context within human communication has not changed much despite these mediations by technological means of communication. Means of communication or the media of communication, and they alone do not constitute communication realities or reality at large, or what is assumed as a reality. The key term in Indian philosophy of communication from the side of Buddhism is our level or levels of understanding of communication. According to a strong tradition in Tibetan Buddhism, there are three levels of understanding of communication, of reality. At the first level, our engagement with reality, or rather our communication centric engagements with reality, are rooted in our assumptions. Assumptions are to be related to what we perceive as appearances of objects and things, including human beings, and our relationships with them. In a sense, objects exist, we exist as objects, and these two objects have certain difference in terms of nature, but not in terms of what is seen as essence, according to Buddhist philosophers like Nagarjuna. This might seem confusing to begin with, but as I proceed further, the audience will get a better picture of what I mean by these three levels of understanding and what I mean by the perceived relationships based on appearances and assumptions. The perceived relationships, the perceived knowledge is assumptive knowledge. We assume that these things exist, we assume that these are the relationships, we assume that these are the objects, but these objects appear to us in terms of their appearances. They are presenting themselves to us in a certain way, and this is the first level of understanding. This is the first level of context, which is communication in nature, because we try to seek knowledge on the basis of our assumptions, and the appearances of objects. So, we are simply guided by how things appear to us in reality, including other fellow human beings and their relationships with the objects. In a classroom, for instance, there is on the one side students, there is on the other side at the end of the classroom the teacher. These are living beings. There are possibly hundreds and thousands of other invisible living beings, including small insects, microbes, ants, etc., which we do not see. We see only the relationship between us, the living object, and the students, another living object, and in terms of how the classroom presents itself through other objects, such as the benches on which the students sit, the chair used by the teacher, and if there is an electronic whiteboard, and if there is a laptop or some gadget, all these present themselves as part of the so-called reality that is not reality enough, or reality that is very deceptive, because this reality is rooted in the logic of appearances and assumptions, according to Buddhist philosophy of communication. They didn't use the word communication explicitly. I am drawing on the inference that this also means a certain reality that is rooted in communication, a communication reality that is deceptive because it is based on assumptions and appearances. This is the first level of communication. So, this means, philosophically speaking, in the context of Tibetan Buddhism and Indian Buddhism, the first level of understanding our reality is a level of understanding that gets us a false picture. We communicate, we do communicate in accessing this false picture, but this communication is not reaching its ultimate end. Ultimate end, according to Buddhist philosophy, is going beyond the ultimate truth. So, in our everyday life, we don't act like philosophers. We are happy and content with this first level of understanding of reality. We don't take seriously the classroom setting in a philosophical context. Classroom setting for us communicates in its own way. We don't see the downside of this. But in the eyes of a Buddhist philosopher, or in this case Tibetan Buddhist philosopher, this is something very flawed. We are seeking knowledge in a manner that is flawed, because we are seeking knowledge in a mode that depends on appearances and what they call as non-intuitive modes of knowledge seeking. So, this identification of the error. So, there is an error which only high level philosophers can see. As a teacher, as an average teacher, I may not understand anything about this error. I enter the class, I finish my lecture, and I leave the place. I go about this in a routine manner. Neither myself nor my students find this as a site of errors. But an high level philosopher rooted in Tibetan Buddhism, those who studied Tibetan philosopher Mila Raspa, his selected works or collected works, would see a certain error, and this certain error is introduced by the flawed mode of seeking knowledge, that is non-intuitive mode of seeking knowledge. So, in our everyday life we seek a relationship with objects, we try to read reality in a very limited sense. This limitation is because of the error, and this limitation is because of the mode of knowledge seeking, that is assumptive and based on appearances. To introduce you to the next level of understanding communication, the next level is a realization that there is an error, that we cannot seek the ultimate reality of this classroom setting, the communication context of this classroom setting, without eliminating this error or the source of the error. And the source of the error is our inability to use intuitive modes of knowledge seeking. So, this recognition that only with the help of intuitive modes of knowledge we can cross the error stage and progress towards the stages of truth, relative truth, ultimate truth, and proceed beyond the point of ultimate truth. So, the second level of understanding our communication reality or the ultimate reality is the recognition of the fact that there is an error in our way of seeking knowledge. The third level is possible, but the third level is beyond average human beings, and even the second level is beyond the scope of understanding by average human beings according to Buddhist philosophical tradition. The second level is accessible to those who have reached the status of bodhisattvas. The third level is accessible to those who have reached the state of Buddhahood or enlightenment. And when you reach the third level, you see, as Milarepa said, a clear sky without any clouds. The sky is free of its fundamental elements that we see in the first level. The sky for the average seeker of knowledge is a sky because of the clouds, the blueness. We can't imagine a sky minus the clouds, minus the elements which make possible the reality we construe as a sky, a beautiful sky. A beautiful sky includes all the discursive elements, and the discursive elements are part of the first level of understanding. We try to group things together and they become discursive. In the third level, when you reach Buddhahood, there is no scope for discursive elements to come together. There is no scope for grouping things together. There is no scope for segregating students from teachers. there is no scope for segregating the non-living objects from living objects in the classroom. Like the clear sky, the classroom looks clear or cleared of the objects, as in the case of the clouded, the sky filled with clouds. The case of the classroom filled with the teacher, students and whatnot, gets rid of the discursive elements. You see the classroom, but you see it in a very clear mode, minus the elements that constitute the classroom. These may not be a perfect example of analogy. The clear sky, which is posited by Miller-Aspa, and the classroom example I am giving may not approximate in a perfect way. But what I am trying to say is the classroom as we perceive is not an indication of true reality or ultimate reality of that setting, because it is based on appearances. How students perceive the teacher is rooted in the logic of appearances of the teacher. How students perceive his lecture is again rooted in the logic of appearances, his lecture or lecture's purport. How teacher perceives the students again depends on the appearances of students and how they present themselves, and all these coalesce with the appearances of the non-living objects in the class and their spatio-temporal location, which further complicates the matter. So, there is this discursive element of space. There is this discursive context of these can also be related as context. After all, we need to engage with 4 fundamental communication elements or context in improving our understanding of these 3 levels of communication, or these 3 meta context of communication, or these 3 modes of reality. And these 4 elements or context include space, time, light and sound. For any context of communication to come alive, forget the reality. Tibetan Buddhism talks about the first level reality, which is flawed, the second level reality, which is based on recognition of the error that the first level is flawed, and the third level reality that is accessible only to someone like Buddha. Forget that logic. Think about the importance of these 4 fundamental contexts of communication made possible by space, time, light and sound. And even in the limited context of the first level, how space appears to be, how time appears to be, how light appears to be, how sound appears to be, and how these 4 contexts of appearances in turn cause what I would call as 4 further level contexts of assumptions about space, time, light and sound. Appearances cause assumptions. Together they cause our perceptions, our thoughts on what we think we experience as reality in the classroom setting. As I am giving this talk, I am drawn towards the appearance of the camera which presents itself as a Japanese made camera, or possibly a camera that carries a Japanese camera manufacturer's name. But it doesn't tell me enough about where it was manufactured, where it was sold, what was its point of sale, how this entered this studio space. So many details are missing. This presents itself at this level, at a very, very rudimentary level, as I am giving this lecture as X brand camera. But I am not sure about when this X brand camera was manufactured, where it was manufactured, who designed it, how the design was made possible, whether the design was made possible by some original ideas or putting together of original ideas and copied ideas, or whether this represents another logical progression in the history of ideas that belong to manufacturing processes concerning digital SLR cameras in the world. That should not be tied only with the manufacturing process that is familiar to this particular X brand camera. That has to be tied with the manufacturing processes of other camera companies that are seen as rivals to these camera company. I assume several things. Likewise, as I mentioned, on the basis of this one primary level appearance of this camera, there are so many other levels of appearances. If I am going to remove the camera, which is not possible as the recording is on, later on after this lecture, if I am going to ask the person here, can I see the bottom of the camera? Can I see the inside of the camera? I get into the secondary and third levels of knowledge seeking based on appearances. Accordingly, I enter into secondary levels of assumptions, and assumptions driven knowledge seeking can progress in this manner. But there is no guarantee that I am getting the truth. The truth about this non-living yet beautiful device that captures this talk on reality that is rooted in appearances and assumptions. So here is a strange reality wherein I critique the first level, second level, third level appearances the camera that is recording this lecture presents to me, and I use this as a model, as a context of critique, or as a context to understand Tibetan Buddhist philosophers' understanding of the first level reality. Simply put, the first level communication context or first level reality or the first level understanding is based on a flawed mode of knowledge seeking. It is flawed, simply put, because it is rooted in appearances driven knowledge seeking. It is rooted in assumptions driven knowledge seeking. More we seek this appearances driven knowledge seeking, the more assumptions we form. The aggregate or the total or the totality of these assumptions at no level can guarantee that this mode of knowledge seeking is error free, that this is getting us the truth about this simple non-living object with which this lecture connects in terms of a relationship. The camera the person who is using the camera, and I am another human being in front of the camera. So many other non-living objects here, and so many living objects which we do not access or see in this room, including microbes, small insects. They are all probably watching us. We don't watch them. We can't feel them. The assumption, to get you some more clarity, the assumption that there are only two human beings, that is myself, the lecturer, and a good friend who is behind the camera, are the two living beings in this room, is a very routine way of dealing with this reality, isn't it? It's an assumption. We are the only two human beings. We are the only two living beings here. This assumption is false. Why it is false? We are probably the only two living human beings here, but we are not the only two living beings here. So there is an error. There are possibly scores of other living beings which we cannot see or perceive with our limited levels of faculty, with our limited levels of audible range of hearing faculty. So there is an error when we seek to get the truth of this communication reality. This is a communication reality, a studio space where I am lighted up, where I am being captured, where there are so many equipments, stands, bags, whatnot. This is a communication reality, but this communication reality is perceived in a very flawed mode. If you believe in the logic of Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, particularly philosopher Milarepa, the moment we recognize that this is flawed, we must be somebody like bodhisattvas, because the second level understanding is nothing but recognition of the fact that the first level reality is false. It is filled with error. So the first level reality is filled with errors because it is not based on intuitive modes of knowledge seeking. So in the second level, we seek to use intuitive modes of knowledge. And when we abandon knowledge seeking based on assumptions and appearances and take up the intuitive mode of knowledge, we can be confident as bodhisattvas, if only we have reached that stage, which is not possible for a person like me or a person like you. Bodhisattvas cannot exist that easily. So the third level is beyond the scope of many of us, except those who have reached the stage of enlightenment. So as I said, the third level, third mode of knowledge seeking is beyond us. Only Buddhas are capable of seeing that communication reality. Many of us claim to be communication scholars, communication students, communication teachers, whatnot. Think about this. In the eyes of Tibetan philosopher, Buddhist philosopher Milarepa, we have no right to call ourselves as masters or experts in communication, because we are yet to cross the first level of understanding the communication reality. So in the conception of Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, as I read it, there are three kinds of communication realities. The first level reality is the most favorite because that is the only one we can access as normal human beings, average human beings. The second level is beyond the scope of 99% of human beings, because 99% are very likely to be or sure to be non-bodhisattvas. The third level again is beyond the scope of even bodhisattvas. So 99.9999% cannot access the third level of communication reality. So there are three levels of communication realities or realities per se, and the first level is one that is accessible to majority of human beings, which we perceive to be the true reality. There is no truth in this perception or assumption or the belief that this is the reality. The truth is absent because the error is present. The truth is elusive because the error is occupying the pedestal. So, unless we cross the first stage by recognizing that there is an error and that makes the truth elusive, we cannot get to the fact that truths are relative truth. There is nothing called truth because there is something called relative truth, and there is something called ultimate truth, and beyond this there is something which is not accessible to any of us. So there is something beyond the ultimate truth also, because we think there is ultimate truth, but it is not the end point. It is not the end point because realities have to be likened to the nature of universes. Just as we cannot fix the end point in the universe or universes, we cannot fix the end point of reality or end point of ultimate truth. This is the essence of Milarepa's conception of three levels of realities, which I paraphrase as three kinds of communication context. There is an additional dimension to these communication realities, and this additional dimension is a significant one. Rather, this additional dimension is not one but is two, or in some cases multiple. Given the temporal scope of this lecture, I would proceed further into the second section, wherein I would be introducing you to the notion of duality and non-duality, as well as the notion of sunyata or emptiness. After the demise of Buddha, several of his followers recontextualized Buddhist philosophy from diverse angles to paraphrase their contributions as communication contributions. First of all, we need to recognize that these great philosophers did not see reality in a discursive manner. With the Foucauldian logic, discursive discourses become the mainstay of critical continental philosophical engagements. But come to think of it, Foucault cannot survive in the face of what Milarepa says as the need for a non-discursive context of discourse. discursive is not to be valorized, is not to be encouraged, is to be abandoned in the conception of Milaraspa, because the clear sky is not possible. The ultimate communication reality is not accessible unless you abandon the discursive project, unless you abandon the categorization of elements and your belongingness vis-a-vis the elements and objects, unless you abandon your love for duality. Now, my love for duality in this room is fixated on seeing the two human beings, including myself, as human beings at one pole and the non-living objects at another pole. So, camera is not living, my laptop is not living, the brown box is not living, the blue chairs are not living, but we two are living, and we are living because we are human beings. So, this is an example of duality, living versus non-living. I already told you that there are possibly hundreds and thousands of living beings in this studio space, like small ants, invisible microbes, etc., small insects. So, at another level, I engage with living human beings and living non-human beings. So, again, I am trying to picture my reality in terms of this prism of duality. I have introduced you to one strand of Buddhist philosophy which gets us three fascinating contexts of communication realities on the basis of what the Tibetan philosopher Milaraspa said. Now, I will take you to the philosophy of the South Indian Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna, in the present day South India, was a Buddhist territory few thousand years back, and in the first few centuries, this area was the citadel of the southern tradition in Buddhism. And one of the key philosophers of this tradition is known by the name Nagarjuna, and his key text, a very complex text, but very seminal text, possibly one text after the famous sermons by Buddha, which advanced Buddhist philosophy to monumental heights, is known as Mula Madhyamika Karika. And this contains Nagarjuna's philosophy of Madhyamika. And what is this philosophy? There are two phases to this. And the central phase belongs to the theory of Sunyata. The theory of Sunyata is rooted in the concept of self-being, or the absence of self-being. In this case, that is the example of the studio space. If you want Nagarjuna to give you a talk or lecture on the self-being of objects here or their non-self-being, you may translate, paraphrase self-being as the essence of the beings here. Heidegger talks about beings in a very convoluted manner, in a very confusing manner, to the extent of clouding our understanding of what constitutes a being. I mean, Heidegger is not confusing. Heidegger is not a very convoluted philosopher, at least to those who have read him, those who know him well. But to the average reader, being a student of philosophy is a being located in confusion, in a messy relationship with the being of the text Heidegger made possible and being of Heidegger himself, or the being of the spatio-temporal location of Heidegger. Nagarjuna may appeal to, on the other hand, even an entry-level student of communication. It is a complex philosophy, but it can be introduced simply on the basis of everyday examples, such as this one, a studio lecture, being and the absence of being. Here, being is not a simple being, it is self-being. Self-being is an hyphenated being, and non-self-being, which refers to the essence of the self-being. As I mentioned, if we are inviting Nagarjuna to give a talk on self-being and non-self-being in a context like this, you would simply say this is a communication reality devoid of self-beings. You may not deny that there is no communication reality, but you would emphatically say that myself, another human being who is handling the camera, we are human beings. We think we are beings, but we lack the essence. We lack the essence to be independent self-beings. There is nothing in us as essence which would make us self-beings like us. There is nothing in this room, whether they happen to be living beings or non-living beings, to make them independent self-beings. So when we lack the essence of self-being, we are dependent on other things in reality. And according to Nagarjuna, none of the things, living or non-living, have this essence of self-being in this world. So, this understanding of reality led him to conclude that we were not created from anything and we will not be destroyed by anything. So, there is no single origin of creation, single origin of destruction, because for the source of origin to create something, it has to have essence, the so-called self-being. Again, drawing on the camera that is recording me, the camera, like myself, lacks the self-being. It lacks the essence, which can make it independent of the wires that are going down, the stand on which it stands, the battery which gives it power, and the adapter which gives the battery the power from the socket, and the socket that draws the power from the local transformer, and the local transformer that draws its power from the state grid that draws the power from the power plant or the national grid, and the state grid and the national grid and the local power plant exist, make power accessible to us, electricity accessible to us, because of what they use, either as nuclear energy or thermal energy or some other kind of energy, which again lacks the essence. It comes from some other source. So in nature, all these lack essence. But we believe this camera is a being, camera is a camera, period. That is our plain stupid understanding of the communication reality constituted by appearances driven communication reality. But the camera is not a camera minus all these things. So, what is real? The absence or emptiness caused by the presence of non-self-being. There is no self-being, there is no essence in the camera, and that constitutes this dependent reality as regards the camera. So, this is a fascinating communication concept or theory with which we can engage with contemporary communication context. For instance, in the case of social media, we create a profile page. We see the comments posted by our friends. We reply to the comments in our WhatsApp group, or we don't reply. What we see what we read, what we reply, are driven by appearances of what we see, what we post, what we comment, or what we don't see. Appearances are tied to assumptions. Assumptions and appearances together constitute the reality, which is sought to be engaged by new media researchers in a very false mode without recognizing that there is an error. So, if you believe in Eastern communication philosophical tradition, there is no way you can do social media research or any media research, because you took an entirely different context for a person like Jean Baudrillard to critique media scenario in the most negative way, which was unthinkable even in the Frankfurt School tradition. When he talks about media implosion, he talks about the disappearance of media as mediating entities between us and our reality. Jean Baudrillard was not a Buddhist philosopher. He was reading media reality from a very, very limited perspective. But in a sense, in this philosophy of Jean Baudrillard, there is at least a trace of the ancient Tibetan Buddhist philosophy of Milarepa and the ancient South Indian Buddhist philosophy of Nagarjuna, that realities do not exist in the way we assume them to be. Realities do not exist in the way they appear to be because of the absence of self-being. And self-beings are non-existent, hence sunyata or emptiness comes into being. None of the objects, none of the things in our reality have the self-being. And self-being would get them independence, not to depend on other things. If this camera has self-being, it doesn't require battery, it doesn't require power, it doesn't require cable, it doesn't require human being. Now it requires everything. But we still make the error that this camera is independent in a way. So the Sunyata philosophy pushes us to the corner blind spot where we remain in a stunned, frozen state, unable to grasp the fact that we cannot claim to be communication scholars, we cannot do social media research or any kind of media research because of this factor of emptiness. What we see, what we read, what we engage with is lacking in self-being, is filled with errors, and hence not something that qualifies as ultimate truth filled reality. There are many other strands of Buddhist philosophy which we can gainfully use to improve our understanding of even the first level reality. I am not encouraging through this lecture that we should become bodhisattvas or we should become Buddhas. I am encouraging the audience to appreciate the ancient communication philosophies of our land, of Asia in particular, and more importantly, as I mentioned in this lecture, the philosophy of Nagarjuna and the philosophy of Milarepa. There are possibly several other contexts of Eastern communication philosophies hidden beneath the mainstream Buddhist philosophy, the mainstream Jaina philosophy. For instance, in the case of another important Eastern communication philosophical tradition, that is Jainism. Again, Jaina philosophy is not a homogeneous one. It has its dualities. Jaina philosophy of the upper regions of India, the Jaina philosophy of the southern regions, and within the larger Indian tradition of Jaina philosophy, you have so many strands which compete with each other in enlightening us, helping to improving our understanding of what is meant by communication reality. What is communication? What is language? To give you one example, you can talk for hours on the philosophical conceptions of Jaina philosophers with regard to something like language. And these conceptions differ from region to region. So there is no one single tradition in Jaina philosophy as regards their conceptions of communication realities. Within the South Indian tradition, you have the tradition that was very prevalent in present day Tamil Nadu, present day Karnataka, which have some subtle differences with the conceptions of Jaina philosophers in northern regions. So there is more we need to engage with. In the next part of lecture, I will engage with Jaina philosophy of communication, as well as some more interesting context of Buddhist philosophy of communication. And finally, I will tell the audience how we can gainfully use these philosophical traditions, native philosophical traditions, to improve our understanding of our communication realities. Thank you very much.